Among many other senior assignments, Ambassador Alexander Vershbow served as the U.S. ambassador to the Republic of Korea from 2005 to 2008. This was during a delicate phase of negotiations in the six-party talks about denuclearizing North Korea.
My first weeks as ambassador in South Korea were much more exciting than I expected because of the controversy that erupted from some of the public comments that I made about North Korea. It was partly about human rights, but the biggest subject that I was focusing on were what we called illicit activities by the North Korean regime. Money laundering through Banco Delta Asia, as well as the illegal production of counterfeit $100 bills, counterfeit cigarettes, narcotics. They were up to no good when it came to their exports. These were very serious concerns. Through the money laundering and through the illegal exports, the North Korean regime was able to finance its nuclear weapons programs and its missile programs. And so I had to make clear that this was an obstacle to any real solution to the North Korean nuclear problem and to any normalization of relations with the North. But calling them a criminal regime was seen as being too harsh to the dialogue partner in the six-party talks. And indeed, the fact that this happened very soon after the breakthrough agreement in September 2005 created a bit of a rift between Washington and Seoul. I remember my first Bush-Roh Moo-hyun meeting in Gyeongju was perhaps the worst bilateral meeting between two presidents that I'd ever seen in my career, because Roh Moo-hyun couldn't understand why the United States would attack North Korea over its financial activities when it had been so forthcoming on the nuclear issue. But in the end, things stabilized, and our policies stayed closely aligned after that.
Although the U.S. and ROK often saw eye to eye with each other during this period, this was not always the case. Ambassador Vershbow endured complex phases of the ROK-U.S. relationship as it evolved into the version we are familiar with today. The results this renewed partnership achieved were partially due to his efforts.
There were a lot of strains in the relationship from the beginning of the Bush administrations, but I think that I was encouraged by the fact that even under a progressive government, which was not a natural partner for a Republican government in Washington, there was a kind of determination to try to iron out some of the differences between Washington and Seoul, not only on the North Korean nuclear issue, where we had a very complex negotiating challenge, but also in terms of deepening the ROK-U.S. alliance, building on the military foundations to begin the process of turning that alliance into a political initiative that aimed to address issues beyond the defense of South Korea against North Korean aggression.
Aside from his significant role in negotiations to denuclearize North Korea, Ambassador Vershbow also helped create a foundation for the U.S.-Korea Free Trade Agreement.
I think that the best moments during my 3 years as ambassador was the conclusion of the Korea-U.S. Free Trade Agreement. I'd never worked on trade agreements, but it was also exciting to be the go-between with the Prime Minister and with the Trade Minister in trying to hammer out the final compromises when we were working against a very strict deadline, because the authority to negotiate the agreement was going to expire, and we actually finished the agreement with about 7 hours to spare against that deadline. The agreement to negotiate a comprehensive FTA was the easy part. Working out the details was more difficult, and there were a lot of thorny issues, particularly related to opening up the agricultural sector, investor-state dispute mechanisms, protection of intellectual property rights, and, of course, setting tariffs that balance the interests of both sides. My only regret about the KORUS FTA is that it did not survive intact when President Obama came into office. Although I tried to persuade some colleagues that I knew who were going to work in the Obama administration that they should ratify the agreement and pursue any additional provisions separately, Obama chose to renegotiate, and that cost, I think, 3 or 4 years, during which time the European Union basically cashed in on all the hard compromises and concessions that the United States had fought for, and signed a FTA with Korea well ahead of the United States, gaining the first mover advantage. I think at least the temporary progress we made on the North Korean nuclear issue and the FTA, I think, all contribute to a much stronger alliance, which I think is still a strong foundation on which we're working today.
Among his many achievements, moving the U.S.'s military base in South Korea remains of particular importance to the South Korean people.
I also think the work that I did on the Defense Alliance was of lasting importance, and it was very exciting to break ground on the new base, which is now just opening in Pyeongtaek, which is enabling the U.S. to finally get out of downtown Seoul and allow this beautiful patch of territory to be returned to the Korean people. And at the same time, modernizing the alliance to incorporate new technologies, new strategies to keep pace with changing developments in the Asia-Pacific region.
But his relationship with the South Korean people had its low points as well.
I'm thinking about the worst moments. I would have to say it was the beef riots that occurred in my final months as ambassador. Because even though Korea agreed in the FTA negotiations that it was going to have to open up its beef market, this proved to be more difficult than anyone expected. And when the new president, Lee Myung-bak, decided to go ahead with a limited opening of the market, it led to mass protests, almost the paralysis of central Seoul for several weeks. A lot of it was fueled by disinformation, some of the things that we've seen more frequently in recent years with the interference by Russia in our elections and other forms of disinformation. But this was an early example of how social media and the internet propagated a lot of false information that caused a certain paranoia among the Korean population and led to these mass protests and even my image being burnt in effigy outside the U.S. Embassy.
Ambassador Vershbow took this in stride and found unconventional ways to rebuild his image and bond with the people of South Korea over a shared passion.
I've always enjoyed being a rock and roll drummer, even though I was never very talented, but it became a kind of diplomatic secret weapon. The first time when I was serving at NATO as ambassador in the late 90s, when I accompanied some visiting American vaudeville groups who performed at my residence, and I sat in on a couple of numbers on the drums. And this evolved into a kind of jam sessions in the garage with other ambassadors who were wannabe rock and roll stars. But it got more serious when I was ambassador to Russia, and I think I reached my absolute peak as a rock star in Korea when I would frequently get the opportunity to play at clubs. In Korea, I played at the jazz club once in a blue moon with a really great Korean blues band headed by Han Sang-won. Well, if my rock drumming was my secret weapon, my less secret weapon was my wife, who is indeed an artist, and she found a very hospitable environment in Korea. It was kind of an interesting coincidence. Even before we knew we were going to Korea, she was able to, through a competition, get some of her pieces in a traveling exhibition that was going to be on display in Insadong. And so it just happened to open a few days after we arrived in Seoul. And so she immediately made a lot of new contacts among the Korean artistic community. And this led to her ability to teach some workshops, to organize exhibitions in Insadong and in other places, and to just generally kind of find ways to build bridges with the artistic community. She even incorporated some Korean elements into her designs. Although she works in non-precious materials, she used green anodized aluminium to create images of bamboo leaves that formed a whole series of her work. And she even did some brooches that used Hangul letters as part of the design. So she had a great time. It was not only fun to do this and highlight some of the cultural connections between our countries. It was again a form of soft power that counteracted the image of the American ambassador, who was always seen as a somewhat domineering, imposing figure in Korea. And I think it broke a lot of ice when I visited universities, playing with local bands, kind of eased the way to a more serious discussion of some of the issues in the ROK-U.S. relationship. I do think Americans don't fully appreciate the depth of our partnership and how much we're actually very alike in terms of our national characteristics. But I try to remind people that we have an important democratic ally in Northeast Asia that fought with us in the Korean War and is still one of our most valuable partners.
In the early stages of his career, Ambassador Vershbow also took part in efforts to transform NATO through his work as the U.S. ambassador to the organization.
There are a lot of similarities between the NATO alliance and the ROK-U.S. alliance. Both are founded on shared values of defending democracy, freedom, and the rule of law, in the sense that they're based on very serious military capabilities, interoperability among the members of the alliance, and a strong defense posture based on being ready to fight tonight if they're ever a threat. So I was very pleased to be able to work on these issues, and this is where my experience at NATO may have been an asset, working to address some of the direct issues affecting the alliance. I think that both the ROK-U.S. alliance and NATO are facing some serious challenges these days, and the challenges come not from the changing threats in the world, but rather from the changing attitude towards alliances on the part of the President of the United States. To my chagrin, we've seen a president who doesn't quite understand how much the United States benefits from having strong democratic allies, whether it's in Europe or in Northeast Asia, and takes an overly transactional approach, defining the alliance largely as a protective service provided by the United States for which we should be paid handsomely in return. So I do worry about this whole issue of burden sharing, which is a serious issue, and South Korea and our European allies need to take this issue seriously. But to define the whole alliance in terms of dollars rather than in terms of shared values and shared interests, I think is a big mistake. So I think both alliances should have a bright future because they're both very effective and they're built on a foundation of real capability and a real commitment to our mutual security. But I just hope that the United States continues to understand it has a kind of intangible benefit from alliances around the world that shouldn't be just reduced to a question of dollars and cents.